In the dim, shadow-drenched darkness of an underground parking garage, Dominic Thorne, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, stood frozen in absolute horror as a woman in a janitor's uniform suddenly snatched his 5-year-old daughter, Rosalie, and vanished into the dark with the brazen speed of a kidnapper. He yanked out his gun, the blood in his veins turning to ice, and a raw, primitive roar tore up from his throat. But only seconds later, Dominic went rigid when the truth hit him. The woman, Alara Vance, a widowed single mother working the night shift as a cleaner, had not attacked his child at all. She had risked everything to save little Rosalie from a runaway SUV with failed brakes that was charging straight toward them like a 2-ton killing machine. Dominic lowered his weapon, yet his cold gray eyes never left the stranger. She sat with her back against a concrete pillar, breathing hard, both arms still locked around Rosalie as if she feared someone might rip the child from her grasp, and the SUV lay less than 3 meters away, its crushed front end smashed into a Mercedes parked nearby. Smoke boiling up into air, made thick with the stench of burning rubber and shattered metal. Rosalie was crying, but not with terror. She was crying with the release of it, the sobs of a child who had slipped past death by the width of a breath, clinging to Alara's collar, her tiny face buried in the shoulder of a woman she did not know, her mouth trembling through tears as she stammered, "She saved me, Daddy. She saved me." Dominic heard his daughter's voice, and something inside his chest tightened with a sharp, aching pain. 4 years. 4 years since Isabel had gone, and Rosalie had never once reached out for anyone on her own. Not the nanny, not the housekeeper, not even him on the nights he tried to pull her into his arms. The child shrinking back like a wounded little animal, afraid of everything, afraid of the whole world, and yet now Rosalie was wrapped around a complete stranger, holding on so hard her tiny fingers blanched with the effort. Roman Blackwell, Dominic's right hand, came running down from the stairwell, breath ragged, his eyes sweeping the scene, taking it in, judging it in an instant, before he delivered a short report. The SUV came down from the upper level. No driver. I had the area locked down. Dominic nodded, but his gaze stayed on Alara, who was murmuring something into Rosalie's ear, her voice so gentle he could not make out the words. Yet whatever she was saying softened his daughter's crying. Rosalie lifted her head, looked at Alara with eyes still wet, and then did something that made both Dominic and Roman go still. She raised a hand, touched Alara's cheek, and smiled. A smile so small and shy it barely seemed real, but it was a smile, and for the first time in 4 years Dominic saw his daughter smile at someone who was not her stuffed bear. Biscuit. His heart drew tight, and he did not know what to name the feeling: relief, pain, or something he had buried long ago beginning to stir again. He stepped closer, slid the gun back into its holster, then crouched to Alara's level, and when she looked up at him, Dominic realized her brown eyes held no fear, only exhaustion, bone-deep weariness, but no fear at all, the eyes of someone who had stared into hell and somehow lived. "Are you all right?" Dominic's voice came out low and rough, as if he had forgotten how to speak to another person without giving an order. Alara nodded, still keeping Rosalie close. "I'm fine. She's the one who matters." Dominic studied her a moment longer, then straightened and signaled Roman. "Investigate the SUV. I want to know why the brakes failed, who drove it here, and why it came down at the exact moment my daughter was standing there." Roman nodded and moved off quickly. Dominic bent down and gently lifted Rosalie into his arms. She did not resist, but her eyes stayed locked on Alara, one hand still reaching back toward her, as if she feared losing something precious. "The lady saved me," Rosalie whispered, her voice as soft as breath. Dominic looked at Alara one last time before turning away. She remained there, back against the concrete pillar, her arms now empty yet still held in the shape of an embrace, as though her body had not caught up to the fact that the child was no longer in them. He did not know who she was. He did not know why she had risked herself for his daughter. But Dominic Thorne, the most notorious Mafia boss in Chicago, the man the entire underworld called the Phantom, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. This woman was not ordinary, and he would find out who she was. If you want to know what happens when a broken widow falls for the most dangerous man in Chicago, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves a good enemies to lovers twist. And subscribe so you don't miss the moment everything falls apart and comes back together. The black Bentley glided through the iron gates of the Thorne estate close to midnight, and Dominic carried Rosalie in his arms, the little girl having drifted off for the entire ride home, yet even in sleep her tiny fingers clung to his lapel, as if she feared being left behind. Mrs. Helena Cross, the housekeeper who had served the Thorne family for 20 years, waited at the front door with worry she could not conceal. She was a stern woman, silver hair pinned up in a neat bun, but her eyes softened the moment she saw Rosalie safe in her father's hold. Dominic gently placed his daughter into her arms, his voice low and worn. "Put her to bed. Don't take your eyes off her." Mrs. Helena nodded, gathered Rosalie close, and turned away. But the child jolted awake, her eyes flying open in panic, both hands reaching for Dominic. "Daddy, where did that lady go? Where's the lady who saved me?" Dominic stopped, his heart giving a sharp, painful beat, and he turned back, bending until he was level with his daughter, forcing his voice to stay gentle. "She went home, Rosie. Go to sleep." But Rosalie shook her head, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. "I want to see her. She held me. She wasn't scared of me." That innocent sentence tore straight through Dominic. She wasn't scared of me. For 4 years, Rosalie had locked herself inside a shell of silence, and he knew the child believed she was the reason people kept their distance. Nannies came and went. No one lasted more than a few months. They feared Dominic, feared his world, and Rosalie felt it. She absorbed it like cold through skin, until she began to think she did not deserve to be loved. Yet the woman tonight had held Rosalie as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Mrs. Helena coaxed Rosalie upstairs, but the child's crying still echoed through the vast hallway, haunting, like a sad melody that refused to end. Dominic stood there for a long time, his fist clenched hard at his side. Then he turned on his heel and walked into his study. The room was pitch black, lit only by moonlight slipping through the large window that faced Lake Michigan. He did not turn on a lamp. Darkness was where he belonged, where his thoughts sharpened into something clear and lethal. The phone in his pocket vibrated. "Roman," Dominic answered, his voice cold and clipped. "Talk." Roman's voice on the other end was taut in a way it rarely was. "We checked the SUV. The brakes were cut, clean, professional. Not an accident, sir. This was deliberate. Someone wanted that vehicle to come down in that exact spot, at that exact time." Dominic said nothing. His grip tightened on the phone until the casing creaked. Someone had tried to kill his daughter. Someone had dared to touch the only thing he had left in this world. 4 years ago, on that fated night, Isabel had thrown herself between him and the enemy's gun. The bullet tore through her chest, and he held his wife as she died, her blood soaking his suit, warm at first, then growing cold. That night, as Isabel let out her last breath, Dominic had sworn to her soul that he would protect Rosalie at any cost. No one would lay a hand on their daughter. No one. Now someone had dared to break that vow. "Any leads?" Dominic's voice dropped, icy, as if every feeling had been sealed away and only pure cruelty remained. Roman hesitated for a brief moment before he answered. "The SUV is registered to a small transport company in the suburbs. The company is a front, indirectly owned by someone you know well. Name: Vincent Moreau." The name rang through the darkness like a curse. Vincent Moreau, the man who had once been Dominic's father's right hand, the man who betrayed the Thorne family and tried to take this underworld empire for himself. 5 years ago, Dominic had beaten him, stripped him of everything, and driven him out of Chicago like a stray dog. Vincent had sworn he would return, that he would take revenge, but Dominic had not believed he would dare. He had dared, and he had aimed at Rosalie. "Find out where he is," Dominic said, and his voice was no longer the voice of a worried father. It was the voice of the Phantom, the Mafia boss the entire underworld feared. "Find him now, and prepare everything. War is coming." He ended the call, stepped to the window, and stared into the ink-black night beyond. Lake Michigan stretched out under the moon, endless, silent, cold, as the heart inside his chest right now. Vincent wanted war, and he would have war. But first, Dominic needed to settle something else. The woman tonight, Elara Vance. Who was she, and why had she risked her life to save his daughter without asking for anything in return? And why had Rosalie, a child frightened of the entire world, trusted her so completely? Dominic did not believe in coincidence. In his world, everything had a reason, everyone had a motive. Yet the eyes of that woman, eyes that did not flinch when she looked straight at him, made Dominic feel something he could not explain. He needed to know more about her. He needed to know who she really was. Elara pushed open the door to her small South Side apartment close to midnight, her body worn down to the bone as if she had just run a marathon straight through hell. The place had one bedroom and a tiny living room that doubled as a kitchen, walls mottled with damp stains and mold, and an old wooden floor that creaked under every step. But it was home, the only safe place she and Caleb had. Mrs. Dolores Ramirez, her 62-year-old neighbor, sat on a frayed sofa reading beneath a weak yellow lamp, and when she heard the door, she looked up, the creases around her eyes brightening with relief. "You're back. Caleb's been asleep since 9. He was good, didn't fuss at all." Alara tried to smile, though she could feel how stiff and false it looked. "Thank you, Mrs. Dolores. I'm sorry I'm late." Mrs. Dolores slipped her bag onto her shoulder and studied Alara with the gaze of someone who had lived long enough to recognize when a person was hiding something. But she did not ask. She only patted Alara's shoulder and left in quiet steps. The door clicked shut, and Alara stood in the dark, alone with the sound of her own breathing echoing through the hushed apartment. She kicked off her worn work shoes and started toward the bathroom, then heard small feet running over the wooden boards. Caleb appeared from the bedroom, brown hair sticking up in every direction, eyes still heavy with sleep, but lighting up the instant he saw her. "Mom!" The 7-year-old rushed into her and clung tight, both arms locked around her waist as if he was afraid she might disappear. Alara dropped to her knees and gathered her son into her arms, her nose buried in hair that smelled like children's shampoo, and her heart cinched painfully, because only a few hours earlier, she had almost lost the chance to hold him like this again. "Why are you home so late? I've been waiting for you." Caleb's voice carried the wounded complaint of a little puppy left at the door. Alara smoothed his hair, forcing her tone to sound ordinary. "I just had a little extra work to do. I'm home now. Go back to sleep. You have school tomorrow." Caleb tipped his face up to hers, and his brown eyes, the same brown as his father's, drilled into her, as if he were searching for the truth. He looked older than his years, a kind of too early maturity in a child who had lost his father at 4, but then he nodded, did not press her, and let her guide him back to bed and pull the blanket up around him. Alara stayed beside him until his breathing evened out again, until she was sure he had sunk deep into sleep, and only then did she rise, walk back to the living room, and sit by the window staring down at the dark alley below. And there, when she no longer had to be strong for anyone, her hands began to shake, violently, uncontrollably, as if all the fear she had forced down for hours was finally breaking loose. She had almost died. She had almost died today. If that SUV had reached them 1 second sooner, if she had reacted 1 beat too late, she and that little girl would have been under its wheels, and Caleb would have been orphaned of both father and mother. Tears slid down Alara's cheeks, but she did not cry out loud. She had learned to weep in silence 3 years ago, on the night she got the call that Marcus was gone. 3 years earlier, her husband, Marcus Vance, a firefighter with the Chicago Fire Department, had died in an apartment building blaze on the south side. The communication system failing, the emergency medical team arriving 15 minutes late, and Marcus dying 20 steps from the exit, choking on smoke as he tried to carry a child to safety. Alara had heard the news while she was feeding Caleb dinner, and she remembered setting the spoon down, watching her son chew his mashed potatoes, then calmly telling him she needed to step out for a moment. She did not cry in front of Caleb. She waited until he was asleep, waited until the apartment fell into darkness, and then she collapsed onto the floor and cried until there were no tears left. After that, Alara cried in silence, always in silence. She lifted a hand to wipe her face and turned toward the photograph of Marcus on the old wooden cabinet. In it he wore his firefighter uniform, smiling wide, warm brown eyes looking straight into the camera as if he were looking straight at her. "I saved a child today," Alara whispered, her voice thick and raw. "A pretty little girl, afraid of the whole world, but she held me like I was the only safe thing she had. You'd be proud of me, wouldn't you?" The photograph did not answer. It never did. Alara drew a deep breath, then reached into her coat pocket, her fingers finding a business card. The business card that man, Dominic Thorne, had given her before he left. No name, no title, only a string of phone numbers printed in silver ink against a pure black background. She did not know who he was. She did not know why he had given her this, but there was something in his cold gray eyes that kept her from throwing it away. Alara opened a drawer, placed the card inside, then closed it. She did not know that this small, simple card would change her life forever. She did not know that the fates of hers and that stranger had begun to weave together the moment she ran to save a child in that shadowed garage, and she did not know. Not yet. That darkness was already preparing to swallow her, in a way she could never have imagined. 3 days had passed since that fateful night in the parking garage, and Alara tried to live as if it had never happened. She still worked the night shift, still mopped floors, hauled trash, scrubbed toilets in a luxury commercial building where she could not even afford a cup of coffee on the ground level, and she tried not to think about the little girl with frightened eyes, not to think about the man with a gaze as cold as ice, not to think about the pure black business card lying untouched in her dresser drawer. But tonight, when her supervisor called her into the office in the middle of her shift, every effort Alara had made to forget dissolved into smoke. She walked down the corridor with her heart pounding hard in her chest, her thoughts spiraling into the worst possibilities. She was getting fired. Of course she was. The incident the other night had caused too much commotion. The police had come. An ambulance had come. The entire basement had been sealed off for hours. Building management could not have been pleased, and who would take the blame if not an anonymous cleaning woman like her? Alara drew a deep breath before pushing open the office door, bracing herself for polished apologies, vague explanations, then a meager severance check and a bitter wish of good luck, but she was not prepared for what waited inside. Dominic Thorne stood in the middle of the room like a statue carved from darkness, dressed in a black three-piece suit tailored perfectly to his broad shoulders and tall frame, black hair slicked neatly back, a sharp angled face betraying no emotion at all, and behind him stood Roman Blackwell, the bodyguard she had seen that night, silent as a deadly shadow. Alara's supervisor, a middle-aged man usually loud and unpleasant, was hunched in the corner with a face gone pale as if he had just looked death in the eye, and when Alara stepped in, he immediately bowed his head to Dominic and hurried out, closing the door behind him, without daring to meet her gaze even once. The room fell into silence. Alara stood with her back straight and her chin lifted, refusing to let fear show on her face, because she had faced things far worse than a kingpin in an expensive suit. She had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, had held the hand of a dying fellow soldier, had received the news of her husband's death, and still stayed steady in front of her 4-year-old son, and she would not tremble for anyone. Dominic looked at her, gray eyes sweeping from head to toe as if he were assessing something. Then he spoke, his voice low and blunt, without ceremony. "Rosalie hasn't slept for 3 nights. Alara blinked, not understanding what that had to do with her, but Dominic went on, his tone still cold yet threaded with something else, something almost fragile hidden beneath the ice. "She keeps asking about you. The lady who saved her. She won't eat, won't speak to anyone. She sits by the window all day, staring outside like she's waiting for someone." Alara felt a sharp ache in her chest at the thought of that tiny girl with tear-soaked eyes clinging to her in the dark garage, but she stayed silent and waited, because she did not know what this man wanted. An instinct warned her he was dangerous, that any word she offered could be turned against her. Dominic stepped closer, and Alara had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. He was nearly a head taller than she was, and his presence filled the room like a storm holding itself back. She thought he would threaten her. She thought he would demand that she keep quiet about what had happened, or warn her not to tell anyone anything. And she was ready to fight, ready to refuse, ready to protect herself and her son at any cost. But what Dominic said next caught her completely off guard. "I want you to move into my house. Take care of Rosalie." Alara opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure she had heard correctly. "What? Your salary will be 20 times what you're making now," Dominic continued, his voice the tone of a man reading terms from a contract. "Your son will attend the best private school in Chicago. All living expenses, medical care, education will be covered. You only need to do one thing, stay with Rosalie." Alara stared at him, as if he had grown another head. This was the most powerful man she had ever met, a man whose presence alone made her supervisor turn paper white. And here he was, offering her a job with terms that would make anyone leap for joy. But Alara was not just anyone. She looked straight into Dominic's cold gray eyes and said, her voice calm but hard as steel, "I don't know who you are, but I know you're dangerous. Men like you don't appear near midnight with generous offers without a purpose. My answer is no." She rose, turned her back on Dominic, and walked toward the door, expecting a hand to clamp down on her shoulder, expecting a threat to crack through the air behind her, but nothing happened. Dominic did not stop her. When Alara set her hand on the doorknob, she heard his voice again, strangely even. "There's an envelope on the desk. You should look at it before you decide." Alara froze. She did not want to turn around, did not want to be curious, did not want to get tangled in anything else connected to this man. yet her feet would not move. She stood there with her hand tight on the knob, her heart hammering out of rhythm in her chest, and she knew that whether she walked out of that room or not, her life was no longer going to be what it had been. Alara stood there with her hand still clamped around the doorknob, but her feet felt nailed to the floor, and she knew she should leave, should walk out of this room and never look back. Yet Dominic's voice drifted behind her like the devil's own whisper, seductive and dangerous at the same time. Open it, then decide. She turned her head and saw the white envelope lying on the desk. It looked harmless, just an ordinary envelope. But Alara knew nothing connected to this man was harmless, and still her feet carried her forward. Her fingers took the envelope, and she opened it with her heart pounding hard against her ribs. Inside was a thin packet, about 10 pages, neatly stapled, and the first page was a report on Lincoln Public Elementary, the school Caleb attended. Alara read line by line, and felt the blood in her body turn colder with every word. The school was set to close at the end of the year due to budget shortages. Students would be reassigned to other schools in the area, most of them farther away. Worse, in neighborhoods she did not want her son stepping into. She flipped to the next page and her hands began to shake. This was Caleb's medical report. His name, his date of birth, her address, his full history, every detail laid out with ruthless precision. Caleb had had asthma since he was little, needed an inhaler and daily preventive medication. The medicine was expensive. Her flimsy health insurance covered only a small portion, and Alara had fought month after month just to keep up with the cost. There were weeks she went without food so Caleb could breathe normally, and now that information was in the hands of a stranger, a man she knew nothing about except that he was dangerous. Alara lifted her head, and her brown eyes flared with anger. "You investigated my son?" Her voice trembled with fury, but she did not shout. She never shouted. She had learned long ago how to lock emotion down, from her years in the military, from the long nights raising a child alone after Marcus was gone. Dominic showed no remorse. He stood there calm and cold, as if invading someone's privacy was the most ordinary thing in the world. "I investigate everyone who gets close to my daughter," he said, his tone flat, without feeling. "You held Rosalie. You touched her. You made her trust you in minutes. I needed to know who you are." Alara wanted to throw the packet in his face, wanted to snap that she did not need anyone's pity, that she could take care of her son without the help of a kingpin in an expensive suit. But before she could speak, Dominic went on, and his voice shifted, still low, still rough, but touched by something else, something that sounded almost weak, almost broken. "Rosalie is the only thing I have left." He paused and drew a deep breath as if he were forcing something down inside himself. "My wife died 4 years ago. Because of me." Silence dropped over the room like a heavy blanket. Alara stood there with the packet still in her hands, but her anger was dissolving, giving way to something she could not name. Dominic did not look at her, and for the first time since she had entered this room, he did not meet her eyes. He stared out the window into the darkness, and when he spoke again, his voice sounded like it was coming from far away, from a place made of pain and regret. "Isabel took a bullet for me. She stepped between me and the enemy's gun. The bullet went through her chest, and I held my wife as she died, her blood soaking my suit." He stopped, jaw tightening hard. Rosalie saw it all. She was only 1 year old, but she saw her mother die in her father's arms. After that, she didn't trust anyone. Not the nannies, not the staff, not even me. She's afraid of everyone, afraid of the entire world. Dominic turned back to Alara, and for the first time she saw something behind those cold gray eyes. Not cruelty, not the arrogant certainty of a powerful man, but pain, the same pain she saw in the mirror every morning, the pain of someone who has lost the other half of himself and has to keep living for a child. "Until she met you," Dominic said, so low it was almost a whisper. For the first time in 4 years, Rosalie reached for a stranger. For the first time in 4 years, she smiled at someone who wasn't her teddy bear. Alara said nothing. She did not know what to say. She stood there with the packet in her hands, looking at the man in front of her, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago, and she saw that he was not so different from her. A lone parent struggling to protect the only child left to him, carrying the weight of guilt and loss on his shoulders. She thought of Marcus, of the night she received the call that he was gone, of the long nights she cried in silence after Caleb fell asleep. She thought of Rosalie, that tiny girl with frightened eyes, who had held Alara like she was the only lifeline in the world. Alara gripped the envelope, turned, and walked to the door. She did not speak, did not promise anything, did not refuse, and did not agree. She simply left, stepped out of the room, and left Dominic standing there alone in the dark. Dominic watched her until the door closed. He did not know if she would come back. He did not know if she would accept or toss that packet into the trash. But for the first time in a long time, Dominic Thorne, the man who never hoped for anything, felt a small spark of hope flare inside his chest. Alara made it back to the small apartment when the night had grown very late. But sleep would not come, and she sat beside Caleb's bed watching her son sink into peaceful rest, his small chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm with each breath. On the worn nightstand, Caleb's asthma inhaler lay there like a constant reminder of what she was fighting against. And she had checked last week. There was only enough medication left for 2 more weeks, and this month the rent had swallowed nearly all of her pay. Alara looked down at the envelope, still in her hands, those thin sheets of paper holding the entire precarious life she and her son were living, and she knew exactly what it was, a bargain with the devil, because Dominic Thorne was not an ordinary businessman, not a kind man looking to help the poor. Danger clung to him like the smell of gunpowder, and any sensible person would run as far as they could from someone like that. But Alara was out of choices. She looked at Caleb, at the innocent face of her child in sleep, and pain stabbed through her chest, because he deserved a better life. He deserved a decent school, full medication every month, the chance to live without the constant fear of whether his mother would have enough money to buy food this week. He deserved everything Alara could not give him. Then she thought of Rosalie, the 5-year-old girl with eyes afraid of the whole world, tiny hands clinging to Alara's collar as if she were the only safe thing on earth, and she remembered the way Rosalie had whispered, "The lady saved me," remembered that small, timid smile appearing for the first time on the child's pale face. And Rosalie deserved love too, deserved care from someone who was not afraid of her. Alara stood and walked to the old wooden cabinet, gazing at Marcus's photograph, and in the dim light his smile was still warm as ever, his brown eyes still gentle, looking at her as if he were right here, standing beside her. "What would you do if you were in my place, Marcus?" Alara whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You'd say, I was crazy to even think about bringing our child into a man like that's house. But you would understand, wouldn't you? You would do anything for Caleb too, just like I would." The photograph did not answer, but Alara knew the answer anyway. Marcus had been a firefighter, and he had died trying to save a child he did not even know from a burning building, and he would never blame her for wanting to save another child, no matter whose daughter that child was. The next morning, when the first sunlight slipped through the dirty window, Alara took out her phone and dialed the number on the pure black business card. Dominic picked up after the first ring, as if he had been waiting for this call all night. "I agree," Alara said, her voice steady and sure. "But on my terms." There was silence on the other end. Then Dominic's voice came through, low and careful. "I'm listening. First, I am not a servant. I will care for Rosalie the way I believe is right, and no one interferes. Second, if at any moment I feel unsafe, I will take my son and leave immediately, and you will not stop me. Third, Caleb is my #1 priority. If anything threatens my child, this arrangement ends." Alara waited for resistance, for bargaining, for at least a scoff, because no one sets conditions with a man like Dominic Thorne and expects him to accept. But Dominic's voice came back without hesitation, without argument. "Agreed. All of it." Alara blinked, surprised even as she tried to hide it. For the first time in her life she had laid down terms to a Mafia boss, and he had accepted without a single question, and she did not know whether that made her feel safer or more afraid. "A car will pick you and Caleb up at 3 this afternoon," Dominic added before ending the call. "Rosalie is waiting." Alara stared at the phone in her hand, then looked over at Caleb sitting at the table, chewing on a piece of bread. She drew a deep breath and walked over to sit beside him. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "we're going to move." Caleb looked up, the same brown eyes as Marcus, widening with curiosity. "Where are we moving, Mom?" Alara smiled, a smile she hoped looked confident enough to keep her son from worrying. "Somewhere very different, my boy." The black Bentley swept through the massive iron gates at 3 in the afternoon exactly as Dominic had said it would, and when the Thorne estate came into view, Alara felt her breath catch in her chest, because this was not a house. It was a modern castle set on a hill, immense glass walls throwing back the late-day sun, an elegant dome lifting against a clear blue sky, and behind it, Lake Michigan stretched without end like a glittering mirror. The front garden was trimmed to perfection, rose bushes in full bloom lining the stone path, and Alara could see at least 5 luxury cars parked in the vast motor court to the left. Caleb, seated beside her in the back seat, stared with his mouth open so wide Alara thought his jaw might drop. "Mom," he whispered, awe spilling into every syllable. "Is this a real castle? Are we going to live here? Like in a fairy tale movie?" Alara tightened her grip on his hand, working to keep her face calm even as her heart thrashed. "Yes, sweetheart, for a while." The car stopped at the front entrance, where an older woman was already waiting on the steps. Mrs. Helena Cross looked exactly like what Alara had always imagined a housekeeper for a wealthy family would be. Silver hair swept into a neat bun, spine perfectly straight, a stern face that gave away nothing. She wore a dark gray outfit, simple but refined, and her sharp eyes swept over Alara and Caleb as if measuring them from head to toe. "Welcome to the Thorne estate," she said in an even, formal tone. "I am Mrs. Helena Cross, the housekeeper. I will introduce you to the rules of this home." Alara nodded and held Caleb's hand tighter as they stepped inside. If the exterior was overwhelming, the interior stole her words entirely. The main hall soared upward beneath a glass ceiling, natural light flooding every corner. A grand staircase curved with quiet elegance toward the upper floor, its wrought iron banister intricately worked with classic patterns. The white marble floor shone so brightly Alara could see her own reflection beneath her feet. "Mrs." Helena led them down a corridor, her voice steady, as if she were reciting a speech she had memorized long ago. "Breakfast is at 7, lunch at 12, dinner at 6. Your room and your grandson's are in the east wing on the 2nd floor. You may enter all areas of the house except Mr. Thorne's study on the 3rd floor unless invited. Rosalie sleeps in the west wing, also on the 2nd floor, and that is where you will spend most of your time." Alara listened and nodded, but her mind was elsewhere, fixed on the little girl she was about to see again. The child who had clung to her in that shadowed garage. The child Dominic said had not slept for 3 nights because she was waiting. "Mrs." Helena stopped at a large door, her hand resting on the knob without turning it yet. She looked at Alara, and for the first time the severity in her face softened just a little. "Rosalie is a special child," she said, her voice lowered. "Please be patient with her." Then she opened the door, and Alara stepped in. The playroom was spacious, washed in light from tall glass windows that looked out over Lake Michigan. Toys were arranged neatly on shelves, expensive stuffed animals, elaborate Lego sets, thick board books, yet everything looked untouched, like a museum rather than a child's room. Rosalie sat by the window with her back to the door, holding a brown teddy bear Alara recognized as Biscuit, tiny in a white dress, black hair braided into 2 plaits, staring out over the water as if she were waiting for someone. "Rosalie." "Mrs." Helena called gently. "Someone has come to see you." The child turned, wide eyes still damp with sadness. But the instant her gaze landed on Alara, everything changed. Those eyes lit up as if someone had struck a match in the dark. Rosalie sprang to her feet, Biscuit dropping to the floor, and she ran across the room on small legs, straight into Elara's arms. Alara dropped to her knees just in time to catch her, and Rosalie clung to her as if Alara would vanish the moment she let go. "She came," Rosalie whispered, her voice thick, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks. "She really came. Rosie waited for her every day. Rosie looked out the window every day, and she really came." Alara held her tight, her nose buried in soft hair that smelled of children's shampoo, and she felt her heart break and mend in the same breath. Behind her she heard Mrs. Helena draw in a sharp inhale, a sound of astonishment she could not hide. And when Alara lifted her head, she saw Dominic standing in the doorway. He stood there silent as a shadow, gray eyes locked on what he was seeing, his daughter, the child who had not touched anyone for 4 years, crying in the arms of a stranger, as if that stranger were her mother. Alara saw something flicker across Dominic's face, the slightest tremor at the corner of his mouth, a flash in those cold eyes, and then he turned away and strode out before anyone could catch the expression he could not afford to show. But Roman Blackwell, standing behind him like a loyal shade, had seen it, and in 10 years of working for Dominic Thorne, this was the first time Roman had ever seen his boss shake. After Rosalie finally calmed in Alara's arms, the little girl only then let go, her eyes still red, but her mouth forming a tiny smile, and Alara brushed the tears from her cheeks before turning to Caleb. Her son was standing shyly in the corner, both hands wrapped tight around an old picture book pressed to his chest like a shield. The wildlife book, the only thing he had brought from their small South Side apartment, the thing he had held through the whole drive here, refusing to set it down for even a second. Alara motioned him closer. "Caleb, this is Rosalie. Say hello." Caleb stepped forward, brown eyes on Rosalie, with a mix of curiosity and caution. And though he was 7, 2 years older than Rosalie, right now he looked small and uncertain, as if he were facing a strange creature he had never seen before. "Hi," Caleb said, his voice no louder than a whisper. Rosalie immediately ducked behind Alara, peeking out with only one eye at the unfamiliar boy, her tiny hand gripping the hem of Alara's shirt so hard Alara could feel the tremor in those small fingers. This was the Rosalie Dominic had described, the child afraid of everyone, the child who trusted only one stranger because that stranger had saved her life. Caleb saw Rosalie hiding behind Alara, and instead of trying to come closer, he did something that surprised Alara. He took a step back, sat down on the icy marble floor, opened the picture book, and began to read aloud. "This is a lion," Caleb read, his finger pointing to the illustration. "A lion is the king of all animals. It lives in Africa, and it has a really big mane." Alara looked at her son, warmth spreading through her chest, because Caleb did not push, did not rush. He simply stayed himself, a gentle, patient boy, so much like Marcus had been, and he kept reading, his voice steady and calm, as if he did not care whether anyone was listening. "This is a giraffe. It has the longest neck of all the animals. It eats leaves up high." Slowly, Alara felt the small hand on her shirt loosen. Rosalie began to tilt her head, wide eyes turning toward the book with growing curiosity, still hiding behind Alara, but no longer shaking. "This is a rabbit," Caleb went on, turning to a new page. "Rabbits have long ears and they like to eat carrots. They can hop really far and really fast." Rosalie suddenly stepped out from behind Alara, moving toward Caleb on tiny, hesitant steps, like a kitten testing new ground. And then she sat down beside him, eyes locked on the rabbit on the page, her small finger pointing at it. "Like Biscuit," Rosalie whispered, her voice light as breath. Caleb looked up at her and nodded solemnly. "Who's Biscuit?" "Rosie's friend," the little girl said, reaching toward the brown teddy bear still lying on the floor. "Biscuit isn't a rabbit, but he's like a rabbit. Mommy gave him to Rosie." Caleb looked at the bear, then back at Rosalie. "Where's your mom?" It was the innocent question of a 7-year-old, but it made the room seem to freeze. Alara wanted to step in, to steer the conversation away, but she was too late. Rosalie lowered her head, eyes dropping to the floor. "Rosie's mom is gone," she said, her voice tiny and sad. "Mommy went to heaven." Silence held for a few seconds, and then Caleb nodded, his face thoughtful, like a little old man. "Caleb's dad did too," he said. "Dad was a firefighter. Dad saved people. Then Dad went to heaven." Rosalie lifted her head, wide eyes on Caleb with something Alara could not name. Not pity, not curiosity, but understanding, the understanding of a child who has lost something, meeting another child who has lost something too. "Is Miss Alara like Rosie's mommy?" Rosalie asked, timidly. Caleb thought for a moment, head tilted to one side as if weighing the answer with all the seriousness he could manage, and then he said, his voice firm with the absolute confidence only a 7-year-old can have, "Caleb's mom is warm." Miss Alara hugged Rosie. "So Rosie feels warm too, right?" Rosalie looked at Caleb, then toward Alara, standing at the doorway, then back at Caleb, and she smiled. A small smile, but real. The first true smile Alara had seen on the child's face since arriving here. "Yes," Rosalie said, her voice like a tiny bell. "Rosie feels warm." The two children looked at each other, and in that moment an invisible thread tied them together. 2 losses finding each other, 2 small souls who had learned grief too early finding each other. Caleb turned to the next page of the old book, and Rosalie leaned closer to see, her shoulder brushing his shoulder, and neither of them realized it was the first time Rosalie had chosen to sit close to anyone besides her father in 4 years. Alara stood in the doorway with her back against the frame, quietly watching the 2 children bent over the worn picture book, and when she heard Rosalie ask, "What animal is this?" and heard Caleb answer patiently, "An elephant. It has a really long trunk." Tears began to slip down Alara's cheeks without her even noticing. A week passed inside the Thorne estate, and the change in Rosalie was so clear, even the most skeptical people had to admit it. She began to laugh, not the stiff, polite smiles Mrs. Helena had tried to teach her for 4 years, but bright bursts of laughter that surprised everyone when Caleb told a ridiculous story about a flying elephant, or when Alara pretended she could not find her during hide-and-seek even though Rosalie was tucked behind the curtain with her legs sticking out in plain sight. Rosalie started talking more too, no longer giving only short 1 or 2 word answers, but asking endless questions: why the sky was blue, why fish could not walk, why Miss Alara's hair was brown while Rosie's was black. Alara took care of Rosalie with the simplest things, the things that did not cost a single cent in a mansion full of expensive toys. She sat and drew with Rosalie using colored pencils, drawing crooked rabbits that made the little girl laugh until she tipped over. She told bedtime fairy tales every night. Not stories from a book, but stories she made up herself, about a little princess with a talking teddy bear and a brave knight who could turn into a butterfly. She took Rosalie and Caleb into the huge garden to play hide-and-seek, letting them run under the sun, their laughter echoing through the rose bushes. Through all of it, Dominic was almost absent, leaving early in the morning before the household was awake and returning close to midnight when everyone had already fallen asleep, and Alara caught only a few glimpses of him moving through the hallway with a phone pressed to his ear, his face tight with strain and his eyes cold as ice. He never stopped to ask after Rosalie, never stepped into the playroom to look at his daughter, and Alara began to wonder whether this man truly cared for the child, or whether he saw Rosalie only as an asset that needed to be protected. But Alara did not know that every night when Dominic returned, he sat in his dark study staring at the security camera feeds, watching Alara read to Rosalie, watching his daughter laugh when Caleb pretended to be a monkey, watching all 3 of them lying on the grass in the garden pointing at the sky and searching for clouds shaped like strange creatures. Mrs. Helena reported to him each day, detailed down to every meal Rosalie finished, every hour she slept well, every time she laughed, and Dominic listened to it all, missing nothing, yet he never stepped into that world, because he was afraid his presence would break the miracle unfolding, afraid the darkness in his life would swallow the light Alara was bringing to his daughter. On the 8th night, Dominic came home later than usual, close to 2 in the morning. A meeting with contacts in the southern part of the city had run long, and the weariness went all the way to his bones. He climbed the staircase in the dark without turning on a light, because he knew every step of this house by heart, and that was when he saw her. Alara was sitting by the window at the end of the second-floor hall, where the moonlit water of Lake Michigan could be seen beyond the glass. She wore simple sleepwear, legs drawn up on the chair, arms wrapped around her knees, and the moonlight on her face made her brown eyes gleam like amber. She could not sleep, and he knew it at once because he recognized that look too well, the look of someone running from ghosts in their dreams. Dominic meant to pass in silence, but Alara turned her head, and her eyes met his in the dark. For a few seconds neither of them spoke. Then Alara said softly, without surprise, as if she had known he was there all along, "You can't sleep either?" Dominic hesitated, then walked closer until he stood a few steps away. "I rarely sleep before 3 in the morning." The silence that followed stretched on, but it was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people too tired to pretend, too exhausted to keep their faces hard. Dominic leaned back against the wall and looked out the window in the same direction Alara was looking. "Why did you take this job?" he asked, his voice low and rough in the late hour. "You know who I am. You know I'm dangerous. Why did you come anyway?" Alara was quiet for a long time. Then she spoke, her voice light as breath. "Because Rosalie looked at me the way Caleb looked at me after Marcus died, like I was the only thing left to hold on to." She paused, eyes still on the shimmering lake. "Marcus, my husband, was a firefighter. 3 years ago he died in a fire while trying to save a child. He almost made it out, but the communication system failed. The rescue team arrived late. He died 20 steps from the exit." Dominic said nothing. He simply stood there and listened, and Alara continued, her voice trembling slightly but never weak. "I couldn't save him. I wasn't there when he needed me. But I can be here for Rosalie, for a child who needs someone who isn't afraid of her darkness." Silence settled over them again, and then Dominic spoke, his voice rough, as if the words had to fight their way out. "You're stronger than you think." Alara turned to look at him, and in that moment, under the pale moonlight, she saw something behind Dominic's cold gray eyes, not the feared Mafia boss the underworld trembled for, but a lonely man holding himself rigid to protect the only thing he had left, sinking beneath guilt and loss and still refusing to let go. Alara looked at him, and for the first time she was no longer afraid. She began to see him, truly see him. 2 weeks after that late-night conversation by the window, Alara began to notice the things that were wrong. The things she had been forcing herself not to see. Maybe because she was too focused on Rosalie and Caleb, or maybe because some part of her did not want to know the truth, but the signs grew harder to ignore. Like cracks in a wall she kept refusing to look at even as they spread. Late at night, when the entire house had fallen asleep, Elara often heard Dominic's phone ringing, heard his low, cold voice through the door of his study, and she could not make out the words, only short, broken commands, yet the tone made her skin crawl, because it was not the voice of a businessman talking contracts or stocks. It was the voice of a man with power over life and death, a man whose every sentence could decide someone's fate. Then there were the men who came and went through the mansion. Men who did not look like company employees or business partners. Men built big and hard, faces and arms cut with scars, eyes sweeping over everything like guns ready to fire. They lowered their heads to Dominic not out of respect but out of fear. A pure, primal fear Elara could almost smell in the air whenever they stood before him. Even Mrs. Helena, stern and unbending, dipped her head slightly and avoided meeting Dominic's eyes when he passed. Roman Blackwell, the man who followed Dominic like a shadow, carried a pistol hidden under his suit jacket that Elara accidentally saw when he bent down to tie his shoe. One morning, while Rosalie and Caleb played in the garden, Elara drew Mrs. Helena aside, her voice low but urgent. "Who is Dominic Thorne, really?" Mrs. Helena looked at her, and something like pity flickered in her eyes before she slowly shook her head. "There are things you are better off not knowing, Miss Vance." That answer did not calm Elara. It only sharpened her unease. That night, after Caleb and Rosalie were sleeping soundly, Elara sat in her room with the old laptop she had brought from the South Side apartment. She opened her browser, her fingers trembling slightly as she typed into the search bar, "Dominic Thorne, Chicago," and the results appeared instantly. Dozens of articles, forums, news sites. Elara clicked the first one, and what she read made the blood in her body turn to ice. Dominic Thorne, the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago, the man who inherited and expanded the Thorne family's underworld empire, controlling nearly all organized crime in the northern half of the city, nicknamed the Phantom because no one had ever seen him lose control, no one had ever seen him flinch, and his enemies often vanished without a trace. The next article spoke about cases the police suspected were connected to the Thorne family but could never gather enough evidence to prosecute. A forum thread traded in chilling rumors. Traders found floating in the Chicago River. Businesses that refused to cooperate suddenly collapsing overnight. It was all rumor, nothing confirmed. But where there was smoke, there was fire. Elara shut the laptop, her hands shaking violently. She was living in the house of a mafia boss. Her son was playing every day with the daughter of a killer. She had eaten at the same table with a man the police would not dare touch, a man the entire city feared. She stood, yanked open the closet, and began to pack. She had to get Caleb out of here tonight, before it was too late, before they were pulled deeper into this dark world. She shoved clothes into a bag, her hands trembling so badly she dropped a few shirts onto the floor. She would wake Caleb, she would call a cab, she would go anywhere as long as it was far from this place. Elara stepped into the hallway, moving toward Caleb's room, but her feet stopped in front of Rosalie's door. She did not know why she stopped. Maybe instinct. Maybe some part of her that could not leave without seeing the little girl one last time. She pushed the door open slightly and looked inside. Rosalie was asleep on the big bed, her small body sunk into white blankets, arms wrapped tight around Biscuit. Moonlight streamed through the window and lit the peaceful lines of her face, and Elara felt a sharp pain in her chest. Then Rosalie stirred, her lips moving in sleep, and she whispered, her voice soft as breath, but clear enough for Elara to hear. "Miss Elara, don't go. Rosie's good. Don't leave Rosie." Elara stood there with her bag on her shoulder, staring at a child dreaming of her, afraid of being abandoned again. She thought of the 4 years Rosalie had lived in fear and loneliness, of the nannies who came and went, of the way the little girl had curled in on herself like a wounded animal because no one stayed long enough for her to trust. And she thought of the last 2 weeks, of Rosalie's bright laughter, of the way the child called her name each morning with shining eyes, of the way Rosalie held her hand in the garden as if Elara might disappear the moment she let go. Elara lowered the bag to the floor. She stepped into the room, sat on the edge of the bed, and gently smoothed Rosalie's soft black hair. She could not leave. Not now. No matter who Dominic Thorne was, no matter how dangerous he might be, Elara could not abandon this child. She had promised herself she would be here for Rosalie, and she would keep that promise, at least until she figured out what she had to do next. The next morning, Alara did not wait for Dominic to leave the house the way he usually did. She got up early, asked Mrs. Helena to watch Caleb and Rosalie, and went straight up to the third floor where Dominic's study was, the place she had been told never to go unless she was invited. She knocked, and Dominic's voice came from inside, low and curt. "Come in." Alara pushed the door open and stepped inside, and she saw Dominic seated behind a massive oak desk, morning light from the window falling across his sharp-featured face. He was going through a thick file, but when he saw her, he set it down, leaned back in his chair, and his gray eyes fixed on her with something that looked almost like expectation. Alara closed the door, walked to the center of the room, and stopped across from him on the other side of the desk. She did not sit, even though an empty chair waited right in front of her, because she wanted to stand, wanted to look him in the eye while she said what she needed to say. "Who are you?" she asked, calm but unyielding. "Who are you really, Dominic Thorne?" Dominic watched her, and there was no surprise on his face, no confusion, no defensive edge, only a frightening composure, as if he had been waiting for this question for a long time, as if he had known it would come sooner or later. "You looked me up," he said, not as a question, but as a statement. Alara nodded, not denying it. "I want to hear it from you. Not from the internet, not from rumors, from you." Silence held for a few seconds. Then Dominic rose and walked to the window, looking out over Lake Michigan spread beneath them. When he spoke, his voice was low and even, as if he were reciting a story he had memorized long ago. "The Thorne family has controlled Chicago's underworld for 3 generations. My father built this empire, and I inherited it when he died 10 years ago. We don't deal drugs. We don't traffic people. That has been the Thorne rule from the start. We control real estate, casinos, protection services, and transactions the outside world never hears about." He turned back to Alara, gray eyes cold but unflinching. "I am a Mafia boss, Miss Vance. I am the Phantom, the man the underworld fears. That is the truth, and I don't intend to dress it up or justify it." Alara felt her breathing grow heavier, but she did not step back. "And Isabel? And Rosalie? And the SUV with the cut brakes?" Dominic drew a deep breath, and for the first time, Alara saw pain flicker across the face that was usually ice. "Isabel died 4 years ago because a bullet meant for me hit her instead. She took it from me, and I held my wife as she died while the man who shot her got away. That man was Vincent Moreau, my father's former ally, the traitor I drove out of Chicago afterward. He swore he would come back for revenge, and now he has." He paused, his voice dropping. "The SUV that night was his people. He is targeting Rosalie because he knows she is my only weakness. He wants me to suffer before he kills me." Alara stood there as the information flooded her mind like a tide. She had suspected, she had read the articles, but hearing Dominic say it out loud still left her reeling. She swallowed hard, then asked the question that had burned in her all night. "Why tell me? Aren't you afraid I'll go to the police?" Dominic met her eyes, and there was something in his gaze Alara could not explain. Not a threat, not a challenge, but an honesty so hard it almost hurt. "Because you are the only person in this house who looks me in the eye without fear. Everyone else bows their head, trembles, says what they think I want to hear. But you don't. You set conditions with me from the beginning. You ask directly what you want to know, and you never lower your eyes for me." He paused, and his voice softened slightly, almost gentle. "And because my daughter needs you more than she needs anyone in this world. Rosalie trusts you, and that trust is more valuable than anything I could ever buy." Silence settled over the room. Alara stood there, her hands clenched at her sides, trying to process what she had just heard. Then she asked, her voice low and shaking slightly, "Have you killed people?" Dominic did not evade, did not hesitate. "Yes, the ones who deserved it." The answer hit Alara like a fist to the chest. She hated it, hated the cold brutality inside it, hated the way he said it as if taking a life were ordinary, and yet some part of her, a dark part she did not want to admit, understood. She thought of Marcus, of the person who caused the fire that killed her husband, and she wondered what she would do if she ever had the chance to face that person. "I need time," Alara said at last, her voice tired. "I need to think." Dominic nodded, not pressing her, not holding her back. "You can leave any time. I won't stop you." 3 days passed after the conversation in Dominic's study, and Alara was still at the Thorne estate, not knowing whether she was making the right choice or walking straight into a mistake, only knowing that every morning when Rosalie ran into her arms with that radiant smile, every afternoon When Caleb and Rosalie sat shoulder to shoulder over a picture book, she could not find the strength to leave. Caleb had a real friend for the first time in his life, a friend who understood loss the way he did, and Alara could not bring herself to steal that from him. And Rosalie had changed too much in these past weeks, from a child curled up in fear in the corner of a room into a little girl who could laugh, who could talk, who could hold on. And Alara could not abandon her, even knowing she lived under the same roof as a mafia boss, even knowing the darkness of Dominic's world could swallow her and her son at any moment. On the third night, when the whole house had fallen asleep, a soft knock came at Alara's door. She opened it and froze when she saw Roman Blackwell standing there, his expression unusually tight, his eyes sweeping the hallway as if checking whether anyone was watching. "Miss Vance," Roman said in a low, urgent voice. "I need to talk to you. Privately." Alara hesitated, then nodded and stepped aside to let him in, closing the door behind them, turning to face the man who was usually silent as Dominic's shadow, and feeling something wrong in the way he held himself, in the way his gaze slid away from hers. "There is something you need to know," Roman said, his voice heavy and grave. "Dominic doesn't know I'm telling you, and I may pay a high price if he finds out, but you deserve the truth." He handed her a file, a dark brown folder, about 20 pages thick, and Alara stared at it with suspicion, even as she reached for it. "What is this?" Roman did not answer, only tipped his head toward the folder, signaling for her to read it herself. Alara opened it, and on the very first page, it felt as if someone had driven a fist into her chest. It was a report on the Southside apartment fire 3 years ago, the fire Marcus died in, the fire she knew so well she could recite every detail, the fire that had haunted her for 3 years. And yet this file held things she had never been told, things no one had ever said out loud to her. The second page was a technical report on the communications system failure that night, the failure that caused the emergency medical team to arrive 15 minutes late, the failure that had indirectly killed Marcus, and the system had been supplied by a company called Meridian Tech. Alara turned the next page and her hands began to shake, because Meridian Tech was a front company, one of dozens of legitimate businesses built to launder money and hide the workings of the Thorn Empire, and the true owner, the name on all the legal papers, was Dominic Thorn. Alara read every page, every line, her eyes skimming numbers, dates, names, and the story grew clearer and crueler with each paragraph. Meridian Tech's communication system had been having problems for months before the fire, but the company delayed repairs to cut costs. And on the night Marcus died, the system collapsed completely for 12 minutes. And when it came back, it was too late. Marcus had choked on smoke, 20 steps from the exit, and the medics arrived only to bring his body out. Her husband had died because of a system failure from a company owned by Dominic Thorn, and indirectly the man she was living with, the man whose daughter called her Miss Alara every day, was tied to Marcus's death. The folder slipped from Alara's hands, pages scattering across the floor, and she stood there, shaking like a leaf in a storm before her knees buckled. She dropped onto the cold floor, covered her face with both hands, and she cried for the first time since Marcus's funeral 3 years ago, the tears she had trapped inside herself for all that time breaking loose like a dam giving way, hot and bitter, soaking her cheeks. She cried with anger, with the feeling of being betrayed by fate, with a cruelty so sharp it felt almost mad. She had come here to care for the daughter of a stranger, and that stranger turned out to be connected to her husband's death. She had held Rosalie every day, loved the little girl like her own, and Rosalie was the child of the man who had indirectly taken Marcus from her. She had looked into Dominic's eyes by the window that night, had seen the pain behind the cold gray, had begun to understand him, had even begun to stop being afraid, and now she learned he was the reason she lost her husband, the reason Caleb lost his father, the reason she had been forced to fight alone for 3 years through poverty and despair. Alara cried until there were no tears left, until her throat burned and her eyes swelled, and she did not even realize Roman was still there, silent in the corner, watching her with an unreadable look. When her sobbing finally faded into broken, choking breaths, Roman spoke, his voice low and sad. "I told you because you deserve the truth. Dominic is not a bad man, but he is not a saint. He has caused a lot of suffering, whether by accident or on purpose, and you are one of the people who has carried the consequences." He paused, looking at Alara curled on the floor like an injured bird. "What you do next is your decision. I have no right to judge." Then Roman opened the door, stepped out, and closed it behind him, leaving Alara alone with the wreckage of the truth. Alara did not sleep all night. She sat on the floor until the first light of dawn slipped through the window, the file still scattered around her like the shards of a world that had collapsed. Her eyes burned raw from crying too much. Her mind spun with chaotic thoughts, and inside her chest, anger boiled like lava waiting to erupt. She thought of Marcus, of his smile, of the way he held her every morning before he went to work, of the promise he would always come back. He had not come back, and now she knew why. Not because of fate, not because of bad luck, but because of a broken communication system from a company owned by Dominic Thorne. When morning fully arrived, Alara stood, gathered the file, and stepped out of her room with heavy feet and a hard, determined purpose. She did not knock. When she reached Dominic's study, she shoved the door open and stormed in, and she slammed the file onto the oak desk with a crack that made Dominic lift his head from the papers he was reading. "Did you know?" Alara asked, her voice trembling from the strain of holding her fury back, her eyes red and swollen as she looked straight into Dominic's. "About the fire, about Meridian Tech, about Marcus." Dominic looked at her, then down at the file. He picked it up, flipped through the pages, and Alara watched his face change, the usual cold composure vanishing, replaced by a pallor that spread from cheek to forehead. By the way, his jaw tightened until muscles jumped under the skin. He read to the last page, set the file down on the desk, and when he looked up at Alara, there was something in his gray eyes she had never seen before. Not coldness, not the unshakable confidence of a powerful boss, but pain and genuine shock. "I didn't know," he said, his voice low and rough. "Meridian Tech is one of dozens of front companies. I don't run it directly. I sign the papers and let other people manage it. I didn't know about the fire. I didn't know the communications system failed. I didn't know about—" He stopped and swallowed hard. "About Marcus. But your name is on the company?" Alara cut in, her voice turning to ice. "You're the owner." Dominic looked at her, and he did not deny it, did not try to explain it away, did not push the blame onto someone else. "Yes, my name is on it. The responsibility is mine." That was the last drop. Everything Alara had been holding back burst like a dam giving way, and she screamed, her voice ripping through the silence of the room. "My husband died because of you. Marcus died because of you. He was a good man. He saved people. He had a 4-year-old son waiting for him to come home, and he died 20 steps from the exit because your damn company couldn't be bothered to fix a broken communications system." She stepped closer, her finger stabbing the air toward Dominic's face, tears spilling again, even though she had thought she had cried herself empty the night before. 3 years. 3 years I raised our child alone, fighting for every dollar, going hungry so I could buy Caleb's medicine, working myself to the bone every night while you sat in this luxury castle with your filthy money, and now you tell me you didn't know. You didn't know. Dominic stood there and took it. He did not argue, did not lash back, did not reach for excuses. He only stood and accepted every accusation, like it was what he deserved to hear. And that silence, that acceptance, did not cool Alara's rage. It sharpened it, because she wanted him to fight, wanted him to give her a reason to hate him completely, wanted the world to become simple. Alara turned and walked to the door. She had decided. She would leave. She would take Caleb away today. She would never look at Dominic Thorne again. She did not need his money, did not need a private school for Caleb, did not need anything from hands stained with blood. But when she opened the door, she froze. Rosalie stood there, right outside the study, wide eyes wet with tears, looking at Alara with the same fear Alara had seen that first night in the parking garage. The child had heard the shouting, had run here, and now she stared as if her world were about to collapse again. "Are you leaving, Miss Alara?" Rosalie asked, her voice shaking on the edge of a sob. "Are you leaving, Rosie? Did Rosie do something wrong? I'm sorry. I'll be good. Please don't go." Alara stood there looking at the 5-year-old, begging her to stay, and all her anger, all her determination to leave, dissolved like morning mist under sunlight. She dropped to her knees and pulled Rosalie into her arms, holding her so tight she could feel the child's panicked heartbeat hammering through their clothes. "No," Alara whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not leaving you." Rosalie cried against her, sobbing hard as if she had carried the fear of abandonment her whole life, and only now dared to let it spill out. Alara held her, tears sliding down her own face, and she realized she could not leave, not because she had forgiven Dominic, not because she had forgotten Marcus, but because she could not abandon this child. Rosalie was not at fault. Rosalie was only a little girl who needed to be loved. Dominic stood in his study watching Ilara hold his daughter through the open doorway. And for the first time in his life, the most notorious mafia boss in Chicago felt truly guilty. Not guilt for the enemies he had taken down, not guilt for the ruthless decisions he had made, but guilt for having unintentionally destroyed the life of an innocent woman and her son. The days that followed moved under a skin of tension and coldness, and Ilara stayed in the Thorn estate, still caring for Rosalie every day, yet avoiding Dominic as if he were a contagion, stepping out when he stepped in, rising from the dining table with the excuse that she needed to check on Caleb the moment he sat down, refusing to meet his eyes, giving him nothing but curt answers when she had no choice, and the invisible wall between them grew so thick that even Rosalie could feel it. Dominic understood. He did not press her, did not try to explain, did not try to apologize with hollow words. He simply gave her space, leaving earlier each morning and coming home later each night. And when they happened to cross paths in the hallway, he only dipped his head in a small nod and passed by in silence, because he knew there were no words that could erase what had happened, no action that could bring Marcus back, and the only thing he could do was let Ilara decide what she wanted. On the 5th night after the confrontation in his study, Ilara lay awake in her bed, restless and sleepless, when she heard crying. Rosalie's crying, not the sulking cry of a child demanding something, but the panicked, terrified sound of a nightmare, and Ilara sprang up at once, bare feet running down the hallway toward Rosalie's room, her heart hammering in her chest, and she pushed the door open and went still at what she saw. Dominic was already there, sitting on Rosalie's bed, with his back against the headboard, his daughter curled in his arms, her small face buried in his chest, her shoulders trembling with choking sobs, and Dominic held her with both arms, one hand patting her back, the other stroking her soft black hair, and he was singing, his voice low and rough, not beautiful, even a little offbeat, but it was a lullaby, an old, gentle melody Ilara had never heard before. It was the first time she had seen Dominic like this. Not the cold, terrifying mafia boss, not the phantom the underworld feared, but a father holding his child after a nightmare, singing her to safety with a song his wife Isabel must have sung when she was alive, and Dominic looked vulnerable, looked shattered, looked like an ordinary man with a wounded heart, rather than an untouchable ruler of violence. Ilara stood in the doorway, not daring to step in, not daring to break the moment, and she watched him hold Rosalie, watched the way he whispered comfort into his daughter's ear, watched the pain and love written plainly on the face that was usually stone, and she felt something inside her soften, if only by a fraction. Little by little, Rosalie calmed, her crying shrinking to small sounds and then fading away, her breathing smoothing out as she drifted back to sleep in her father's arms, and Dominic remained there, motionless, unwilling to wake her, until he finally lifted his head, and his gray eyes found Ilara standing at the door. They looked at each other in silence, and for the first time in many days, there was no coldness, no hostility in the space between their gazes, only exhaustion, pain, and perhaps something close to understanding. Dominic gently laid Rosalie back on her pillow, pulled the blanket up over her, then rose from the bed and walked toward Ilara, and when he stopped in front of her, he spoke in a voice that was low and raw, saying that he would find the person directly responsible for that system failure, the manager of Meridian Tech, the one who chose not to repair the system even though they knew it had problems, and that he would make them pay for what they caused. Ilara did not answer. She did not know what to say, did not know whether she wanted that, did not know whether revenge could offer any kind of comfort, but she did not turn away either, and as she looked into Dominic's eyes, she realized something between them was changing. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but a quiet recognition of each other's grief, something beginning to thaw between them, slowly and painfully, like a wound trying to heal, but real. A week passed after the night Dominic sang Rosalie to sleep, and everything inside the Thorn estate began to settle in a strange, uneasy way. Ilara and Dominic still kept their distance, still did not speak beyond what was necessary, but the icy tension between them had thinned, and sometimes their eyes met across the dining table, and instead of looking away, they gave each other a small nod, a silent greeting, and sometimes Dominic came home earlier than usual, sat in the living room watching Rosalie and Caleb play, and Ilara no longer stood up and left the moment she saw him. It was not reconciliation, not forgiveness, but a quiet acceptance that they were sharing the same space for the sake of the children. That morning, Ilara woke up late, which was unusual because she always rose before dawn, before Rosalie and Caleb even opened their eyes. But the night before she had stayed up talking with Mrs. Helena about the menu for Rosalie's upcoming birthday, and the exhaustion had pulled her into deeper sleep than usual. Sunlight filled the room when she opened her eyes, and she glanced at the clock with a jolt of alarm. 8 in the morning. Rosalie would have been up for a long time, waiting for her. Alara threw on her clothes and hurried down the hall toward Rosalie's room, already forming an apology for oversleeping, but the words died on her lips the moment she saw what was in front of her. The bed was empty, the blankets and pillows neatly arranged as if no one had slept there at all, and the window stood wide open, the screen slashed in a long cut from top to bottom, the line sharp and clean like a scalpel. Alara's heart stopped. She ran to the bed and scanned the room with desperate hope that Rosalie was hiding somewhere, playing hide-and-seek the way she often did. But the room was empty, silent in a way that stole the air from her lungs, and on the white pillow lay a piece of paper. Alara picked it up with shaking hands, and the black capital letters swam before her eyes like a curse. "If you want the girl back, come alone. 47 North Pier. If I see police or your men, the girl dies." Alara screamed, a sound that ripped through the morning stillness and echoed through the mansion like a siren. She screamed Dominic's name until her throat went raw, and then she heard pounding footsteps on the stairs, doors slamming, voices calling in frantic confusion. Dominic appeared in the doorway only seconds later, in his suit but without his tie, clearly on his way out when the scream reached him, and he looked at Alara, looked at the note in her hand, and his face changed in an instant, draining white as if every drop of blood had vanished, then flushing with a primal, lethal fury. He snatched the note from Alara's fingers and read it fast, and Alara saw his jaw clench until the muscles jumped beneath his skin, saw his gray eyes darken like a sky before a storm, saw his hand close into a fist until the knuckles went bone-white. Vincent Moreau. Dominic spat the name like a curse, his voice so low and cold that a chill ran up Alara's spine. "He's finally moved." Alara stared at him and remembered what Dominic had told her about Vincent Moreau, the enemy who had hunted him for 5 years, the traitor driven out of Chicago, the man who had sworn revenge, and Vincent would not dare face Dominic head-on. He knew he could not win a direct war, so he aimed for the one thing Dominic loved most, the only thing that could bring even the coldest Mafia boss in Chicago to his knees, his daughter. Dominic pulled out his phone and dialed with fingers that still trembled from rage. "Roman, now, get here. Prepare the men, all of them." He ended the call, looked at Alara, and in his eyes was something she had never seen before. Not only anger but fear, the fear of a father about to lose his only child. "Stay here," he said to Alara, short and absolute. "Watch Caleb. I'll bring Rosalie back." But Alara shook her head. She stepped closer, caught Dominic's hand, and her voice shook, but it was so firm there was no room for argument. "I'm coming with you." Dominic opened his mouth to refuse, to say it was too dangerous, to order her to stay the way he ordered everyone else. But then he looked into her eyes, saw the blaze of determination in that brown gaze, saw the love she carried for Rosalie, no less fierce than his own, and he knew there were no words that would stop her. He nodded, gripped her hand tight, and together they walked out of the empty room, toward the darkness that was waiting. Roman Blackwell reached the estate only 15 minutes after the call, bringing 4 large men with faces like stone and guns hidden beneath their suit jackets. They gathered in Dominic's study, a map of the North Pier area spread across the desk, and the tension was so thick, Alara could feel it like an invisible fog filling the room. Dominic stood at the head of the table, gray eyes sweeping the map, and when he spoke his voice was cold and final, as if he were discussing a business deal rather than his daughter's life. "I'll go alone." Exactly the way Vincent demanded. "He wants me. He'll have me." Roman objected at once, his brows drawing together with a rare strain of worry on the face that was usually unreadable. "It's too dangerous, sir. This is obviously a trap. Vincent isn't stupid enough to think you'll truly come alone without a plan. He's waiting for something, maybe an ambush, maybe something worse." Dominic shook his head, jaw clenched. "He has Rosalie. I don't have another choice." Alara stood in the corner, silent, listening to the argument. She watched Dominic, the way his fingers gripped the edge of the desk until his knuckles went white, the fear and desperation hidden beneath his icy control. She knew he was ready to die for Rosalie, ready to walk into Vincent's obvious trap without any guarantee at all, and it made her respect him and furious at him in the same breath for that blind recklessness. Roman proposed another plan, His team would surround the warehouse from a distance and wait for the right moment to move in. But Dominic refused, saying Vincent would kill Rosalie instantly if he saw any sign of Dominic's men. The argument dragged on, tension climbing, and Alara stayed quiet, as if she were only an observer with no place in it at all. Then she spoke, her voice cutting cleanly through the room full of men. "I'm going too." Everyone turned to her. Roman looked startled, the other men looked doubtful, and Dominic looked horrified, as if she had announced she was going to step off a cliff. "No," Dominic said immediately, his voice hard, leaving no space for negotiation. "Absolutely not. It's too dangerous." Alara stepped closer and met his cold gray gaze without flinching. "I'm a former combat medic. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I've faced situations more dangerous than an abandoned warehouse more times than I can count. I know what to do when things go bad." She paused and drew a breath. "And more importantly, Rosalie trusts me. If she sees me, she'll be calmer. She won't panic. She won't do something that makes Vincent lose patience. I can help, Dominic. Let me help." Dominic shook his head. But Alara was not finished. She took one more step, and her voice tightened as the next words forced their way out. "I lost Marcus because I wasn't there when he needed me. I wasn't with him in that fire. I didn't hold his hand when he died. I couldn't do anything to save him. For 3 years I've lived with that regret every day." Tears began to shimmer in her eyes, but her tone stayed steady. "I won't let that happen again. Not to anyone. Not to Rosalie." Dominic looked at her, and something shifted in his eyes. He looked at the woman standing in front of him, a woman with every reason in the world to hate him, to step aside and let him deal alone with the consequences of a war he had created. Yet instead she was willing to risk her life for his daughter, willing to step into the dark with him, knowing she might never come back out. "All right," Dominic said at last, his voice softening a fraction. "You're coming with me," Roman protested, but Dominic lifted a hand to cut him off. They planned quickly. Dominic would enter the warehouse first, alone, just as Vincent demanded. Alara would follow 5 minutes later, slipping in through the back door while Vincent's attention was fixed on Dominic. Roman and his team would wait 2 blocks away, ready to storm in when they received the signal. They left the estate in 2 separate cars. On the drive to North Pier, Dominic and Alara sat in silence, the air heavy with everything they could not say. When the car stopped 1 block from the warehouse, Dominic turned to Alara, his gray eyes deep with emotions she could not fully read. "If something happens," he said, low and rough, "protect Rosalie. Get her out. Don't worry about me." Alara looked back at him, and she did not answer. She would not promise something she was not sure she could keep. The abandoned warehouse at 47 North Pier looked like a dying monster in the late afternoon light. Its red brick walls blotched with mold and graffiti, its corrugated metal roof rusted through with holes as if termites had chewed it, and the stench of damp rot mixed with corroded metal hit the nose the moment you stepped through the old iron door. Dominic went in alone, his footsteps echoing on cracked concrete, gray eyes cutting through the thick darkness as he searched for his daughter's shape. He found them at the center of the warehouse, where light from a few dangling bulbs overhead created a dim pool of illumination in a sea of shadow. Vincent Moreau stood there, 42 years old, so polished he looked almost monstrous in this ruined place, wearing an expensive gray suit, hair slicked neatly back, and if you did not look into his eyes, you might mistake him for a successful businessman instead of a blood-hungry madman. But his eyes gave him away, black as 2 pits, glittering with a vicious, fevered light Dominic had seen too many times in his years in the underworld. Rosalie sat on a wooden chair a few steps from Vincent, her hands tied behind her back with rope, her mouth sealed with black tape. Her eyes were swollen red from crying, and when she saw her father, fresh tears rolled down her cheeks, the sound of her sobs strangled under the tape. Dominic felt his heart splinter at the sight of her, felt rage surge through his veins like molten rock, but he forced it down, shoved it deep into his chest. He needed to stay calm, needed to buy time for Alara to slip in from behind. 4 of Vincent's men were scattered around the warehouse, each holding a gun, each watching Dominic with wary focus. Dominic realized he was completely unarmed, completely alone, completely at their mercy, and Vincent knew it. Vincent smiled, the smile of a cat playing with a mouse it intended to tear apart. "The Great Phantom," Vincent said, his voice light and smooth, like he was reciting a poem. "The Mafia boss all of Chicago fears, and he can't even protect his own little girl. How tragic." Dominic did not answer. His eyes stayed locked on Rosalie, trying to send her the message that Daddy was here, that she would be all right. But inside him fear gnawed like a wild animal. Vincent was not a fool. He would not let Rosalie go easily, and Dominic did not know what he would have to pay to save her. "What do you want?" Dominic asked, his voice cold and level, showing nothing even as he was breaking apart inside. Vincent tilted his head, looking thoughtful, as if the question amused him. "What do I want? I want you to suffer, Dominic. I want you to watch everything you love get taken from you, the way you took everything from me 5 years ago." He began to circle Dominic, steps light as a dancer's, his voice turning conversational, as if he were sharing a delicious secret. "Do you know about that apartment fire on the south side 3 years ago? The one where Meridian Tech's communications system failed, and the rescue team arrived 15 minutes late." Dominic went rigid, and a cold sensation began to spread through his chest. He knew about the fire. He knew about Marcus. Vincent continued, the smile on his mouth widening. "You thought it was an accident. Thought the system just failed on its own. So naive." He stopped in front of Dominic and stared straight into his eyes. "I'm the one who ordered that system sabotaged. I wanted a big scandal. I wanted your front companies weakened. I wanted you investigated, suspected, attacked from every direction. That was the first step in my revenge." Dominic felt as if someone had punched him in the chest and knocked all the air from his lungs. Vincent did not stop. He was savoring every flicker of pain on Dominic's face. A firefighter died in that fire. Marcus Vance. He tried to save a child, but because the system went down, the rescue team arrived late, and he choked on smoke and died. Vincent gave a shrug, his indifference cruel enough to make the air taste sharp. Collateral damage. Not worth mentioning. From the darkness at the back of the warehouse, Alara heard every word. She had slipped in through the rear entrance just as planned, and was hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates, waiting for her moment. But when Vincent's words rang out into the open space, she felt as if all the blood had been drained from her body and poured back in as acid. Her husband had not died by accident. Her husband had not died because of a system failure. Her husband had been murdered. Marcus had been killed by the man standing in front of her. Killed as collateral damage in a sick revenge plot. For 3 years she had suffered, asked herself why fate could be so cruel, blamed Dominic for the failure of a company he owned. But the truth was far more horrific. Marcus had not died because of fate. Marcus died because a madman wanted to hurt someone else. Alara felt her blood boil, felt a rage so fierce she wanted to scream, wanted to burst from her hiding place and tear Vincent apart with her bare hands. But she held it down, grinding her teeth until she tasted blood, because Rosalie needed her, and she could not let emotion take the wheel and ruin everything. Then her foot landed on a rotten board, and it creaked in the warehouse silence. Vincent snapped his head toward the sound, black eyes narrowing, and he signaled one of his men. The man charged into the shadows, and seconds later he hauled Alara into the light, her arm twisted painfully behind her back. "Ah," Vincent said, his voice bright, like he had just been handed an unexpected gift. "We have another guest, the woman who saved the girl in that parking garage." He tilted his head, studying Alara with interest. "Marcus Vance's widow. Perfect." Vincent drew a gun from inside his suit and pointed it straight at Rosalie, who trembled on the chair, and he smiled, the smile of a demon enjoying a blood feast. "Now," he said, almost cheerful, "we have an interesting riddle. Who dies first?" "Adian." Dominic stood motionless under Vincent's gun, but his hand moved quietly toward the front of his shirt, where a tiny communications device was hidden beneath the fabric. He needed only to press a button, only a light touch, and Roman would receive the signal. He needed time, needed to keep Vincent talking long enough for backup to arrive. "You think killing my daughter will solve anything?" Dominic asked, his voice strangely calm even as everything inside him boiled. "You think I'll break and let you take everything?" Vincent laughed, the sound echoing through the empty warehouse like a crow's cry. "I don't need your empire, Dominic. I only need you to suffer. I want to watch you lose everything you love, the way I lost everything because of you." While the two men faced off, Alara moved in silence. The thug who had been holding her loosened his grip as he got pulled into the conversation, and she used that moment to slip free, edging toward Rosalie. Her steps were so light they seemed to have no weight, her breath held tight in her chest, her eyes never leaving the child trembling on the chair. Dominic pressed the hidden button, and seconds later hell broke open. The main doors of the warehouse flew wide with a deafening crash, Roman and 4 of his men storming in like a whirlwind, guns up and ready to fire. At the same time, side doors were kicked in, more of Dominic's people flooding inside, and the warehouse turned into a battlefield in an instant. Gunshots thundered, shouts ricocheted, and Alara lunged for Rosalie while everyone was consumed with each other. She pulled a small knife from inside her boot, a habit left over from her military days, and with a few clean, decisive cuts, she sliced through the rope, binding Rosalie's hands. She tore the black tape from the girl's mouth, and Rosalie immediately broke into sobs, small arms locking around Alara's neck as if afraid Alara would vanish. Miss Alara, Rosalie cried, shaking all over. Alara gathered her close, shielding her with her own body, and she scanned for a way out. In the center of the warehouse, Dominic and Vincent were fighting hand to hand. Vincent had dropped his gun in the chaos, and now the two men crashed into each other with fists and elbows, with the pure brutality of men trying to kill one another. Dominic was stronger, faster, but Vincent fought with the madness of someone with nothing left to lose, and they tore at each other like wild animals in a fight to the death. Alara lifted Rosalie and started toward the rear exit, but she did not see the thug she had slipped away from earlier. He was in a dark corner with a gun aimed straight at Rosalie, and he pulled the trigger. Time seemed to slow. Alara saw the black mouth of the barrel, saw his finger tightening on the trigger, and she did not think. The instinct of a mother, the instinct of a soldier, the instinct of a human being willing to die for the child in her arms took over her body. She twisted, putting her back between Rosalie and the gun, and she felt the bullet tear through her left shoulder before she even heard the shot. Pain like a red-hot iron driven through her flesh. Alara went down, knees striking the cold concrete, but she did not let Rosalie go. She wrapped the little girl tight, shielding her with her bleeding body, refusing to let another bullet touch this child. Blood soaked her shirt, hot and wet, and the world began to blur at the edges. Dominic heard the shot, heard Rosalie scream, and he turned just in time to see Alara collapse, with blood spreading across her shoulder. Something inside Dominic shattered, something primal and savage and beyond control. He swung back to Vincent, and in Dominic's gray eyes there was no cold calculation left, only the pure fury of a cornered beast. Dominic knocked Vincent unconscious in seconds, every punch a hammer blow, no technique, no strategy, only raw violence from a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. Vincent hit the floor, face bloody, unmoving. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, coming closer. Roman had quietly called the police before they came here, a final safeguard in case everything went bad. Squad cars surged in, officers poured into the warehouse, and Vincent and the surviving thugs were cuffed and dragged away. But Dominic cared about nothing except Alara. He ran to her, dropped to his knees, pressed his hand to the wound on her shoulder to stop the bleeding, and he shouted for an ambulance, his voice rough with desperation. Alara lay on the cold concrete, blood slipping through Dominic's fingers, but she still held Rosalie with her other arm, still would not let go even as consciousness began to fade. Rosalie sobbed, tears and snot streaking down her small face, and she clung to Alara, begging in a broken, choking voice. "Miss Alara, don't die. Don't leave me. Miss Alara, please don't leave Rosie." 10:10. The ambulance tore through the night with its siren screaming, and Dominic sat beside the stretcher, gripping Alara's ice-cold hand and not letting go for even a second. The medics were busy stopping the bleeding, checking her blood pressure, running fluids, but Dominic saw none of it, saw nothing but the pale face of the woman lying in front of him. She had bled for his daughter, had used her own body as a shield for Rosalie, and now she was here, her breathing thin, her life hanging by a fragile thread. Rosalie had been taken in another vehicle with Roman, the little girl crying and calling Alara's name until she exhausted herself and fell asleep in Roman's arms. When they reached the hospital, Alara was rushed straight into surgery, and the double doors slammed shut in Dominic's face like a wall, cutting him off from the person who held a piece of his heart he had not even realized was there until now. The surgery lasted 4 hours. 4 hours in which Dominic sat in the waiting room with trembling hands and red-rimmed eyes. He, Dominic Thorne, the Phantom, the Mafia boss all of Chicago feared, the man who never lost his composure for anything, sat here like the most ordinary man alive, a man terrified of losing someone who mattered. Rosalie slept in his arms, her small face streaked with dried tears, her tiny hands clinging to the lapel of his jacket as if she was afraid of being abandoned again. She was drained from crying, drained from fear, and now she wanted only to stay close to the one adult she still had left. An hour after the surgery began, Mrs. Helena arrived with Caleb. The 7-year-old scanned the waiting room with panicked eyes, searching for his mother, And when he saw Dominic sitting there with Rosalie in his arms, he ran to them, said nothing, only sank into the chair beside them, and reached for Rosalie's hand, where it peeked out from the blanket. 2 children, one asleep from exhaustion, one awake with worry, and their hands found each other in the hospital waiting room's shadow. Dominic looked down at Rosalie in his arms, then at Caleb beside him with a face too old for his age, and he realized something he had been blind to for far too long. Alara had given him what money and power could never buy, a real family, not an underworld empire full of trembling soldiers, not empty luxury mansions, but the laughter of 2 children in the garden, a dinner table with 4 people around it, the feeling of what it meant to come home for real. And the person who had brought all of that into his life was lying in an operating room, fighting for her life because she had saved his daughter. 4 hours crawled by like 4 centuries, and when the surgery doors finally opened, Dominic sprang to his feet. Rosalie woke at the movement and lifted her head too, eyes still heavy with sleep. The doctor stepped out, his face tired but his eyes relieved. "She's going to be all right," the doctor said, and those were the 5 most beautiful words Dominic had ever heard. "The bullet has been removed. It didn't hit a major artery. It only damaged soft tissue. She'll need time to recover, a few weeks of physical therapy, but she'll make a full recovery." Dominic let out a shaky breath and only then realized he had been holding it for 4 hours. His legs threatened to give way, and he had to grip the back of the chair to steady himself. Rosalie slipped down from the seat and ran to tug at the doctor's coat, her eyes bright with hope. "Miss Alara didn't die. She'll come home with Rosie?" The doctor smiled and crouched to Rosalie's level. "She'll be okay, sweetheart. She's very strong." An hour later, Dominic was allowed to see Alara. She lay in the hospital bed, her face pale but her breathing steady now, her left shoulder wrapped in thick bandages. A heart monitor beeped in a steady rhythm beside her, and an IV line ran from her arm to the bag hanging above. Dominic sat in the chair by the bed and took Alara's hand, warmer now than it had been in the ambulance, yet still small and fragile inside his. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice rough as if he had not spoken in years. "For everything. For Rosalie. For not leaving when you had every reason to. For saving my daughter even though you know who I am. Even though you know what I indirectly caused for you." He paused and swallowed hard. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met, Alara. And I—" He did not finish. Alara was still unconscious, not hearing any of it, but somewhere deep in that half-dark place between sleep and waking, her fingers tightened faintly around his hand, an answer that needed no words. A few weeks passed after the horror of that night in the warehouse, and the Thorne estate slowly came back to life with sounds it had been missing for years. Children's laughter echoing through the hallways, running feet on the stairs, voices calling out to each other across the wide garden. Alara recovered a little more each day, her shoulder still wrapped in bandages but able to move gently now, and she was no longer confined to a hospital bed. She had begun walking through the house again, even though Mrs. Helena kept scolding that she needed more rest. But Alara could not lie still when Rosalie kept running into the room every few minutes to make sure she was still there, when Caleb needed someone to help him with homework, when this whole house needed her in a way she had never been needed like this in her life. She stayed at the Thorne estate, but no longer as a hired hand. No one said it out loud, yet everything had changed. Mrs. Helena stopped calling her Miss Vance and began calling her by her first name. Roman nodded to her with a small smile instead of his usual blank face. And Dominic looked at her with an expression she did not know how to name, but it made her heart beat faster every time she caught it. Rosalie did not let Alara out of her sight after she came home from the hospital. The little girl followed her like a tiny shadow, holding her hand on walks in the garden, sitting beside her at breakfast, sleeping in her room every night because she was afraid that if she looked away, Alara would disappear the way Isabel had disappeared. Then one day, as Alara brushed Rosalie's hair in front of the mirror, Rosalie suddenly lifted her chin and spoke, her voice small but steady. "Mom, Alara." Alara froze, the hand holding the brush suspended in midair. She looked into the mirror and saw Rosalie's wide eyes staring at her with all the trust and love a child could give. "Can I call you Mom, Alara?" Rosalie asked, timid as if she expected to be turned away. "Mom Isabel is in heaven, but Mom Alara is here with me. I want to have 2 moms." Alara dropped to her knees, pulled the child into her arms, and she cried, but these were happy tears. "Of course, sweetheart. You can call me Mom Alara." Caleb and Rosalie became brother and sister, not by blood but by heart. The 7-year-old protected his 5-year-old sister as if it were the most important mission of his life, teaching her chess even though she did not understand the rules yet, reading to her every night, holding her hand whenever she was afraid of the dark, and Rosalie followed Caleb everywhere, calling him Big Brother Caleb with a proud little voice, bragging to everyone that she had the best big brother in the world. Dominic changed too, slowly but clearly, like spring thawing ice. He began coming home earlier, no more late nights in the study with mysterious calls, replaced by dinners with all 4 of them around the table. He learned how to talk to Rosalie, not with expensive gifts or short orders, but with questions about her day, bedtime stories told in his own voice, hugs he had forgotten how to give. He learned how to talk to Caleb as well, asking about school, friends, the things the boy dreamed of, and listening with real attention instead of the absence the child had grown used to from adults in his life. And Dominic began to smile. Not often, not the bright movie smiles, but real ones. Small curves at the corner of his mouth when he watched Rosalie laugh, when he heard Caleb tell a funny story, when his eyes met Alara's across the dinner table. On a late autumn afternoon, when the leaves had turned a blazing gold and orange, the whole family took a walk in the park by Lake Michigan. Rosalie and Caleb ran ahead, their laughter floating in the clean air, mixing with the soft rhythm of waves brushing the shore. Dominic and Alara walked side by side, not holding hands, not touching, but the distance between them had narrowed until their shoulders almost brushed with every step. Rosalie suddenly turned, ran back to them with cheeks pink from the autumn wind and eyes sparkling, and she took Dominic's hand with her left, took Alara's with her right, then looked up at them both with the brightest smile Alara had ever seen on her face. "Dad, Mom Alara," Rosalie asked, her voice clear as a bell. "We're a family, right?" Dominic looked at Alara. Alara looked back at him. No one answered with words, but the answer was already there in their eyes, in the way they smiled together, in the way Dominic reached across and took Alara's hand above Rosalie's small shoulder. "Yes, sweetheart," Alara finally said, her voice thick with tears and happiness. "We're a family." They walked into the sunset with 4 hands locked tight, Rosalie in the middle, Caleb running back to take Dominic's other hand, and they formed a line along the lakeside path. The late sunlight fell over them like a warm blanket, and their shadows stretched long on the ground, 4 shadows merging into one. This was not a perfect fairy tale. Dominic was still a mafia boss, still carrying dark secrets in his past, still with enemies out there somewhere. Alara still carried the pain of losing Marcus, still woke from nightmares, still was learning how to forgive and let go. But they had each other. They had Rosalie and Caleb. They had one home, not built from brick and mortar, but built from love, sacrifice, and the rare second chances life sometimes gives. And for the first time in a long time, none of them were afraid of the dark anymore, because they had found light in one another. Our story ends here, but the lesson it leaves behind remains. Sometimes the best things in life come from the most painful beginnings. Sometimes a stranger becomes family, and wounds that seem impossible to heal are soothed by the love of hearts that have been broken in the same places. Alara lost her husband, but she found a new family. Dominic lived in darkness for years, but he found light through a brave woman who dared to meet his eyes without fear. And 2 children, one without a mother and one without a father, found each other and found a home where they were loved without condition. Life is not always fair, and fate can be cruel in ways that feel impossible to believe. But in the middle of loss and grief there is always hope, always a chance to begin again, always hands willing to hold us when we fall, and the important thing is whether we dare to open our hearts and accept it. If this story touched your heart, please tap the like button to support our channel. Share this video with the friends who believe in second chances and unexpected love. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the emotional stories we bring you every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel. Have you ever faced anything similar in your life? Do you believe 2 strangers can become each other's family? Leave a comment below and share what's in your heart. We will read every line and we hope to hear your story. Thank you for spending your time with this video. We wish you and your loved ones good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we will see you in the next video.